Ah, Mark, you're back.
Hello, Vic. How are you?
I'm good. We've got a dust cart now unloading outside. I don't know whether you're going to hear it. Probably won't. But anyway,
I don't know. Well, I there's potential for me to have people drilling, operating
heavy machine.
sanders, heavy machinery, roofers. But luckily, it's lunchtime in France, so as you can
Oh,
imagine,
crikey, we've got ages then.
yeah, everybody's going to knock off until at least 3 o'clock.
Yeah, I know. That's good.
Yeah,
Yeah, as you know, that doesn't happen here. Cool
yeah.
stuff. Anyway, so Mark Fitzpatrick, you're back again, and we're going to be talking about the book.
Yes. Which the rest of what we did the last time was all preamble
It
to
was
actually talking about the book. Yeah.
the book. You haven't got a copy of it there. You can
Um,
flash up on the screen. Don't worry if you.
Yeah, no, I do there. I actually have just outside the room. I have
No, no, don't.
yeah, a
That's fine.
large doctor's bag, an
Yes,
old
I know.
19th century leather doctor's bag, which has dozens of copies in it, and which I stupidly tried to carry to Paris for my book launch, and I overloaded it so much, like I put 100 copies of the book in it, and as soon as I got to the train station, one of the handles broke because this is an old bag, like it's a genuine like 100-year-old bag, and so the handle broke, and so I had to carry it like in my arms or on my shoulder. I weighed it when I got home. It's 20 kilos. I was carrying 20 kilos worth of books plus my luggage. Um, and it was just one of those things like, we used to joke, myself and my shrink, that my unconscious is very on the nose. Like I always do stuff, or if I have a dream or something, it's always really obvious the symbolism. And this was just, me, typical me, like making things difficult, carrying this ridiculous burden through train stations and um, up and down steps and like sort of falling over.
So in a way, it's a journey through Paris, right?
Mm, yeah,
With a burden. But
absolutely.
so in a strange sort of way, there is a theme there that is sort of in your book.
Yes, indeed. I mean, and I also I do that as well. Like in my fiction, I always end up writing stuff that then comes true, or playing out symbolically sort of things that are going on in my real life in the fiction, and then, but it gets freaky when you do it in the fiction, and
Yeah.
then it comes true in real life, but
Yes.
without sort of like it shouldn't, stuff that's like uncanny. It's fine if you write something that you think about and you end up playing out that dynamic that's kind of natural. But just as a really quick example, I had that book launch then in Paris, in the most wonderful location, which used to be my local because I used to work around the corner and just go there for lunch. And they really sort of, the people there remembered me, and they went all out and kind of, they even made a special menu for the evening with the name of the cabaret from the book, the Cabaret de la Sirène, and they put on it all these cocktails that were like um, era specific, like late 19th century cocktails, and they made like
Wow.
absinthe punch in silver bowls with sort of silver like goblets, and it was amazing.
Wow.
But one of the things that happened was um, I had lined up, like I kind of wanted to do it like it was as if it was a cabaret act, a cabaret thing,
Yeah, yeah.
and I had lined up someone who's going to play the piano, and someone was going to dress as the green fairy, like the absinthe
Yeah.
fairy, and kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
shimmy around. And for various reasons, like the pianist, I got the keyboard to the place, but the pianist got called to read the news on TV, so he had to go and do that. And then the green fairy was actually green without makeup that morning. She was really sick, so she couldn't come, and all this stuff. But I did get two of my friends who volunteered to sing one of the songs that's performed in the book. And it's a traditional Irish song called Shularoon. And the two of them, like the way they dressed and the way they looked that night, they were dressed in the clothes that the two female characters who sing in the book are described as wearing. Now, I hadn't coordinated with them, I hadn't asked
No,
them to do this. They were just wearing the right colors, the right kind of clothes. They themselves had the right sort of hair colors and stuff. And it was really uncanny,
yeah,
like really uncanny that they were playing these parts that they had dressed for without knowing. I, they hadn't read the book yet.
no, no, I know, I know. This is, I, this stuff um, is common. You know,
Yeah.
this happens a lot.
Well, this
I
this
mean,
would be
there's
right.
even a term for it, isn't there? You know, when life,
Imitates art.
impersonates art, right?
Hmm. I
But
mean,
it does.
it's
That's the
this
thing.
this would be very much up your alley too. Like when you talk about like say songwriting or
Yeah,
writing narrative or writing um making a piece of art that then kind of conjures the thing into your life that you have
yeah,
evoked. I mean, I think that the fact that this book, that Unreal City, was in the end the first one that I published, because I've written other books, like I've written two other books and half written several more. And it was really unexpected that this would be the one which ended up being my first published book. But it is so fitting in a way because it ties together all these different aspects of my life, my interests, because it's about it's late 19th century, which is the period that I studied, and it's very much kind of a pastiche of some of that late Victorian Gothic and French decadent fin de siècle literature that I was studying at the time when I wrote it. And it's also got like the kind of academic satire of being presented as um, the work of a writer from the 1960s who was doing a pastiche of kind of earlier work, and that it's presented by an editor who's a present day academic but who is also not me. So there's like layers and layers of
mm,
um pretense
mm,
and sort of fun games. But then it's also about Paris, and it's about arriving in Paris as a kind of a young, naive ingenue, which I did, and about the sort of, I suppose that it kind of gives a kind of a symbolic version of the temptations that are available to a person, to a young person. And then it's also, not just the kind of gothic thriller thing, but it's also quite a snapshot of at the time the state of my research and knowledge of the occult and of um, sort of occult history and stuff like that, um, and all in a very playful way. And so what's great as well is like it's this really slim volume. It's kind of a good calling card.
mm. Oh, yes, yes. That's that's a good point. There's, I think I might have mentioned this to you before, but I think it's quite important that things that you create, whether that's a book or sorry, things keep popping up, or a CD or whatever,
Mm,
in my case, you could probably earn more from them being a calling card than
yeah.
just selling them.
Indeed.
Because
Oh,
it,
you mean like literally using them as a calling card, like giving them out to people?
yeah, yeah,
Well, I actually have been doing that, funnily enough,
mm,
because there was an interesting thing happened with my very, very first print run. There was a sort of like I did a little trial run because I had to do a small order to see how I could get it through customs because they got printed in England.
yes,
And it did indeed get held up in customs for over 2 weeks because I hadn't filled in all the right, VAT exemption forms and stuff.
yeah,
And and it was hilarious because so I just ordered a few just to see, and they weren't like the official first 100 print run that I kind of did like a signed and numbered edition. these were just the first few just to get my hands on copies of the book. And because they waited in customs for 2 weeks, um, the covers were actually slightly foxed from moisture, very, very
Oh,
slightly. And they ended up arriving on the day that I had specified as the day of publication, which was Halloween on the 31st of October, which
right.
is also the day on which, in 1894, the biggest kind of chunk of events of the novel actually happen. Um, and so they arrived, and we moved into our new house, and we had a Halloween party, which we used to do as kids. Like my parents used to throw a Halloween party for us because my brother and I had birthdays either side of Halloween, and so they would do a big Halloween party. And so it was great. It was the first time that I have been able to have one for my kids and invite our friends and their kids and my kids' friends. And we decorated the house, and we went out trick or treating in the village, and it was brilliant. And my book had arrived, so I was kind of like, oh wow, this is just it's the best. And one of our guests, he picked up the book and he opened it, and the first page, he goes, "You're going to hate me." There's a typo on the very first page,
Oh,
like
they'll spot it. Yeah,
in the in the author bio. There was a typo. There was a missing word,
yeah.
and it was really obvious. And I had obviously just missed, like, I cut and pasted the text, and I'd somehow like managed to delete a word, and so I was just appalled. And also, the ISBN on the inside didn't correspond to the ISBN on the back, on the barcode.
Right.
So I was like, holy shit. So what'll I do? But it turns out those few copies that I had then became, well, I can't really sell them, right? Because they're properly flawed. Like the copyright information is incorrect. And there's a slight discoloration on you barely see it on the cover and so on, and this stupid misprint. And so I ended up using them literally kind of as calling cards because I had them with me. And for example, um, I I moved seats on the train so that I up to Paris so that I could kind of spread out a bit. And there was another woman in one of these kind of four, two facing two with a table in the middle, and she was a bit spread out. And I said, "Do you mind if I sit here?" She had all these papers, and they were she was correcting um, she was correcting homework. And we got chatting, and it turns out that she is a professor in the university in Bordeaux. She's correcting translation homework. She's in the English department. Um, she offered me a job to do some hours. And I said, well, I don't have a card that's up to date, but I've got a novel. Let me just write my details in the
That's
front
it.
page of the novel, and gave her one.
Yeah.
And she was delighted. And so, and when I was walking around Paris, I had a few copies, and it happened that I fell into conversation with people a couple of times who seemed interested. And I was like, well, you know what? Have one, have a copy,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
and just wrote my information in it. Um, and so I actually did what you just suggested. I used it literally as a calling card. Um, but it's also true that this book can hopefully, slightly get on the radar of some people. I don't know. Um, I was thinking about this. I gave up on the idea of making a living as a writer long before I ever actually managed to get anything published. Um, just when I was writing my first book 20 years ago, and I had these great dreams that I was going to be like a sort of literary bestseller, sort of like um, posh literary fiction kind of Booker Prize stuff. That was what I wanted to do because I thought that's what you should do. Like that was proper literature. And so I remember just reading a few articles or talking to a few writers because I was working in a bookshop in Paris at the time,
Mm.
and just being completely disillusioned, like realizing that unless you're a massive bestseller, and even then, you can't make a living these days as a writer. And that was 20 years ago, and it's even worse now. Um, you can't make a living solely from earning royalties on books you publish unless, you know, unless they get sold, so the film rights get sold, or they get sold for a series with Netflix, or unless they unless you're publishing a book a year and they're selling millions of copies. Um, because even people who are doing quite respectably, as I've found out, um, in terms of sales, they're making less money um,
Yeah.
than what authors used to 30, 40 years ago. What the author gets paid has become less, but the publishers are earning more. You know,
Yes.
books are selling, books are doing great. Um, but bookshops and writers
Yeah.
are struggling, and the only people who aren't struggling are the publishers, and they're all 80% of them are owned by the big five kind of conglomerates. So I mean, it's the same with music. It's the same with any kind of other creative pursuits. People have to spend most of their time making bloody TikTok trailers for their book or whatever. Um, like
Yes, they
it's
do.
and I've just resigned myself to say, like, okay, I am not going to make a living as a writer. Um, I will, teach little bits and pieces here and there, and I'll do some translation, and I'll do some research assistant work, and I'll maybe pick up a few, like I say, like part-time hours in the university. And I'll publish books. I've set up a publishing house for that. That might at least break even. I mean, I hope so, because I can't afford it if it doesn't. But I don't expect to have a career where I will sit in my study and produce works of genius and get paid a lavish lifestyle for it. And the other part of it, like, that they expect writers these days and musicians and artists, to be a brand, to be a content creator, to have platforms and followers and like, share, and follow, and blah blah blah. Um, I do stuff on social media, but I do it because I enjoy it
Yes.
for
Well, it's the same
itself.
as me, isn't it? Mark?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know that. I do this sort of thing because I enjoy doing it.
Mm. And I
And
do it. You know, I have a podcast and a YouTube channel, and I do stuff on Instagram and on
yeah,
Facebook, and I even have started doing TikTok just to see. And the thing is, I enjoy making little films and little videos and
yeah,
little things, and what I've decided is that I use that to share work that I don't really expect to make money. Like, for example, little short kind of, little mini articles or essays, poetry. There's no money in poetry, but I enjoy sharing that stuff.
yeah.
And I just want, like, I really want to do that stuff, and it not to be something that I expect to make money from, because I've seen people who do that and they end up being like absolutely full of anxiety about, did I schedule my posts at the right time for, maximum engagement, or, it's just like, who
So
cares?
I think that's a really interesting point because I know some podcasters where, it's about the subject that they're going to do is targeted in such a way that they get more downloads.
Yeah, yeah.
Obviously, I don't do that. Um,
Me neither.
well, the point is, if you want an interesting conversation with somebody, you're already shackled to a series of ideas, aren't you? You
I
know,
suppose.
well, you are because before you started off, you've already got these. You've got a series of um, rules and regulations you set for yourself about what you can
Yeah,
talk about.
yeah, yeah. True, true, true.
You know, and that doesn't make for a conversation that flows, in
Mm.
my opinion. But
Oh yeah. You mean if you're trying to do a particular format and a particular, like, you know a particular theme that you think is gonna
well, this
sell.
is what people actually do, right?
Mm.
I know this from the point of view of, doing it because the statistics are pointing them in a particular way.
Yeah,
Now, I've already, because of, I've thought a lot about this in the creative process with regard to music, about how technology starts to dictate to you how you create
Mm.
music
Yeah.
instead of using the technology to capture the music that you're creating.
Mm.
For
Yeah.
me, that's the tail wagging the dog,
Mm.
you
Indeed.
see. But we've always done it. This is not a new thing. This is what we've always done. So you would record now in a particular way because the technology is easy to do it in a particular way.
Yeah.
Instead of getting a whole bunch of people in a studio and recording certain elements of it live,
Yeah.
and certain things that you want to overdub because you need to play more than one guitar, let's say, right?
Mm. Do you know,
But
I'm just having a thought. Like you're saying this isn't anything new.
no,
And I'm just imagining like taking it back to, let's say, the transition between sort of baroque music and kind of more romantic music with the invention of the pianoforte, where before they were playing on a harpsichord, and so their music was very much this kind of fast moving kind of ding a ling a ling a ling a ling a ling a ling, and then when you've got like a sustain and an echo, and you can choose to sustain or not the notes, and it lends itself to a much more kind of flowing and dramatic kind of style. But you can imagine the Baroque composers with their harpsichords going, yeah, 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 look at these. They'd be like sneering at it like auto tune, you know? It's like, oh, you can't hear any good keyboard music without this, you know, big sustain pedal dramatic bullshit these days.
yeah, yeah.
It must
So
have
it
always
works
been the
both ways,
same.
as you. It is exactly the same, because in that instant, you know, you're saying about the sort of Baroque composers who are obviously not Bach, but you know what I mean. It's that
Mm,
sort of thing of the people who know the process, and that's what they're doing. The
mm,
technology is of how they produce the music is fixing them in a particular place.
yeah.
Where the technology is great is when people misappropriate the
Yes.
stuff.
Yes. This is what I was going to say is that like if you take the technology and you mess with it and you subvert it, like I mean, I'm just thinking about like, turntables and record scratching and sampling and stuff like that. It wasn't designed for that.
No,
But people
exactly the
found
point.
out, right? They found out, they're like, oh, listen to this. This is amazing, and that's subversive. And that's, you know,
Exactly. I think that's a really important point. Same thing as you've said about language. You know, particularly the fact that the English language is great for being able to
yes.
steal things from somewhere else and all the rest of it, and what
Yeah.
you can do with that language. It's not straitjacket. There's no straitjacket in there. Okay, there's certain people who say that's not good English or whatever, but it's like,
Yeah.
well, English is English. I mean, depending
Yeah.
on how you look at it, right? Which
Mm.
which
It's
dialect you
true.
want to
It's
use.
true. And I think that, yeah, we were having that discussion last week or the week before, and this idea that obviously it's not the only language or the best language or whatever, but English does have, in comparison to the other competitors that once existed to be the kind of Western world lingua franca, which literally means French, right? The French language was the lingua franca of diplomacy and of the nobility. And but what English had as an edge was that permeability to other influences and the ability to basically gobble up other languages and you know steal their stuff in a sense, like sort of in
Yes,
a almost in a colonialist sense, but also even though it appropriated vocabulary and words from all these other sources, um, that lends itself to great subversive potential. Like you can,
yeah,
um, and as people have and do in all the different dialects and slang and argot and patois of English, they um, they have a healthy disrespect because there is no central authority. There is nobody saying, "Here is what proper English is." Um, unlike, and the comparison I made at that time was unlike in French, where you've got the Académie Française, which is very protectionist and very prescriptivist. Like we say what's right and we make rulings on it. Whereas in English, the approach has always more been descriptivist in the sense that we just observe the language as it is and describe what it is. Like, dictionaries get new words every year and they make a big deal of it. They're like, what words have made it into the dictionary? because they've been mentioned X number of times.
Hmm.
And it's very easy in English to create neologisms because there's so many resources to do it. And you can make neologisms that are transparent, that are understandable, even if the person's never heard the word before. You can
Yes.
create a word that is easily legible,
Yeah.
um, and then and you can do it with humor and puns. And I mean, the one that just jumps into mind because I think it made it into the dictionary a couple of years ago, but it's like a perennial favorite. But it was is the word mansplaining,
Yes.
right? Because that word is a kind of a portmanteau word that says exactly what it says, and um, and then you can trace its history through. It was the Rebecca Solnit article, "Men Explain Things to Me." She didn't actually coin the word; she just coined the kind of named the concept, which was that she kept coming across where men she would meet who did not know very much about something would try to explain it to her, even if she was literally the person who wrote the book. Like
Yes.
they would be quoting her own book, saying, "Oh, you should really read this very important book," and she'd be like, "Yes, I know." Um, and then somebody came up with that brilliant coinage, mansplaining. Um, and I mean, there's so many others. Like it's almost become a sport
Yeah.
in
In
English
fact, I
to.
interviewed somebody
Mm,
who created a little dictionary of words that she'd created.
mm,
There's a woman called, well, she's called Shazzy, right?
mm-hmm,
She's sort of raw food type.
mm.
Well, she was a bit of a guru in that sort of, vegan
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
areas. Down in the well, near enough to Brighton, basically.
Mm.
So, but she one of them that she came out with, I thought was absolutely brilliant. And she, as I say, she produced loads of these in the backs
Mm.
of books that she's done. Was a stupor market.
A stupor market. Brilliant, brilliant.
So
Um,
that's that sort of thing when you go in, and of course, you are literally bludgeoned by. Well, we've got a supermarket called Budgeons, but bludgeoned
yeah.
by what was there. So in the end,
Mm.
you didn't really know what you were buying. You weren't making
Yeah,
the
yeah,
decisions. It was being foisted
yeah.
on you.
And I can
Yes, a
imagine that
supermarket.
I can imagine that somebody who was a fan of raw and vegan food would also say like all of this highly processed,
Oh God,
high
yes,
corn syrup stuff. That all that food, the processed food, does put you into a stupor
yes,
because
he would have said that.
so it's a great one. And there's also a there's a competition actually every year, and I remember can't remember who holds it, but I think it's one of the American newspapers. Um, but the idea is that you take a word and you just twist it slightly and give it a new definition. And some of them are just amazing. Like for example, one of them was uh, just to tell you what kind of thing it is. Reincarnation is coming back as a hillbilly. Um, or inoculate is an intravenous injection of coffee,
Yeah, that's
or
great. That's brilliant. I love it.
osteopornosis, a degenerate disease. You know, but like it's like that kind of
Oh,
thing that English
yeah,
speakers have, which is this joy and pride in playing with words. I mean, every language has this, but the kind of people who love cryptic crosswords and they
yeah,
love
yeah, yeah.
puns and they love um it's great. And I think that to bring it back to my book,
Yes, I
um,
was just waiting for you to pause, and I
yeah,
was going to say that, but go on,
well,
fine.
to bring it back to the book, like one of the things that I did in the book, and I think I really pulled it off, was I was so immersed at that time when I first wrote it in the literature of the late 19th and early 20th century. And I was so immersed in those kind of voices and that kind of diction and that kind of um, sort of register of language. But what I tried to do was I tried to absolutely as faithfully as I could reproduce it. And in the book, there's multiple different voices. Like it's sort of an epistolary novel,
Mm,
and it's much on the model of let's say Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is, told through journals and letters and reports, or Dracula, which is also told through documents. They're documents written by the characters. Um, some of them are journals, some of them are diaries, some of them are letters. And so I did it like that. And so I'm actually trying to capture at least three different voices, if not more. Um, and, how does this person speak at that time from this background? Um, how do they write? And I think I pulled off that feat of it's pastiche, I suppose. It's like you're taking these elements and trying to kind of fake them, um, using only the tools available at the time, as in the kind of words and vocabulary, trying to
Mm.
ban yourself from using modern
Yes.
vocabulary. Um, and my dad, who is a mathematician, is a great word nerd as well. He loves language. And after he read it for the second time, he sent me a whole list of, he found a few typos because he's a very good sort of copy editor, but he also sent me a wonderful list of quibbles, like saying, okay, this word, the way you spelt it there, I don't think that that is authentic to the period. Um,
Right.
and we had a really interesting back and forth. Like, for example, um, I wrote the word mitching from school, meaning skipping school, and I wrote it Miching. And he said, no, no, you've either got to spell it Mitching, Mitch, for the pronunciation, or Meech, Meeching.
Mm.
And he sent me like an etymological dictionary definition
Right.
to back up his point. And I said, but you see, the spelling I'm using, I got from James Joyce's Dubliners. And because the person involved is Irish,
Yeah.
and because it is approximately around the turn of the 20th century, I believe that the precedent of this spelling in the story An Encounter, which I think is one of the first ones in Dubliners, the second maybe, um, and uh, and so he said, okay, fair enough, I'll concede that one. But then, and he was kind of saying, okay, well, what about this? Like, are you sure that at this time they would have known about this thing, or is that not like anachronistic? So it was brilliant.
Mm.
He read it with wonderful nerdy attention to the kind of the feel of the words, but also their provenance and their etymology and their exact historical moment. Um, and I've had, you know, the pleasure of having some other readers um, who have also brought that kind of attention to it, but in different ways. Like
Mm.
some people who are very familiar with the literature of that era would have come with kind of like, oh, I love this detail and I love that detail and the
Yeah.
way
Yeah.
you got this voice. And then some people who are more familiar with the sort of, say, occult side
Mm.
of it would have got a real kick out of some of the in jokes that are in
Mm.
it for that. And other people who are very good at reading in terms of kind of symbolism and mythic resonance, they found things in it that I didn't know I'd put in, that I'd forgotten I put in, or that I was never aware that I put in. But when they told me, I was like, oh yes, that makes sense, you know. And so that wonderful thing of that once you let it out into the world, it's not really yours
Yeah.
anymore, you know.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I really loved the book. I thought it was great.
Oh, thank you.
And the thing that really, because I liked the detail that you put in, um, and and as you said, the voices came across. I thought really well. But of course, I was obviously interested in the sort of the occult references, and I
Yeah.
thought they were really very well detailed, and it was interesting because I've heard you read tarot,
Hmm.
and there were obviously certain things you said there was like, oh, okay, it
Yeah.
was like you were doing a reading in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
way that you would have done a reading, which was interesting.
But I think that I mean, it is interesting because if you imagine that I wrote that book or started writing that book a bit over 10 years ago, and so I guess that what were seeing was the traces of the kind of the formation or the maturation of my kind of symbolic
mm,
imagination, my kind of
mm.
symbolic set of references. And yeah, like when I look back at it and I look back at the notebooks from then, um, there's a load of stuff
Mm.
in that book that is not even visible. Like there is a bunch of stuff about tarot, about
Yes,
about Kabbalah, about
yes,
sort of obscure kind of mythological references and esoteric references that like they're there, and sometimes they are like obscured and occulted to the point where you can't even see them anymore, but I know they're there.
yes, yeah. Now here's a point. This is an interesting thing. There's a guy that I know who's written a what would you call it? It's a book of it's sort of a book of about somebody. Well, you know, you get these sort of tropes where there's a book, a magical
Mm-hmm.
book
Yeah,
that's like the Ninth Gate, that type of thing, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's a book. It's a bit like that. But what's interesting is he's got some very interesting playing with time.
Mm.
But when he gets into the magical detail, you know he might be interested in magic, but he's not a magician,
Yeah, that's that's a
right?
really interesting that's a
Yeah,
really interesting phenomenon.
because it doesn't quite sit right.
Mm.
And obviously, that's certainly not the case with your book, because it does sit in a way you think, no, this is, yeah, it's got that sort of aroma of it being real. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like the
Um,
opposite. It's like the opposite of an odor of sanctity. It's got a kind of a kind of
yes,
an aroma of desecration and you know,
yes, yeah.
um,
It's you know that there's a sort of how can I put this? A mustiness
yes, yes,
about it. That's the thing. It like you would imagine that stuff not being quite well, certainly not what was I'm mixing metaphors here, certainly not kosher. You know what I mean?
yes, yes, exactly, exactly.
It's to taboo breaking
There's
aspect.
there's a little bit there's that kind of like sulfurous element for sure,
Exactly.
and there's
Yes.
also that kind of hint of um, I think there's that kind of hint of frankincense to a certain thing. Like there's different atmospheres, and some of them are that more kind of like pungent,
Yes.
like
Exactly.
that smells like I imagine an opium den would smell,
Yes.
or
That's
you know,
exactly what I'm getting at.
or you've got like, or you got the other one which is, and then this kind of comes to one of the things in it, which is that the setup is that you've got this young ingenue, a young novice priest, and you've got two sort of older occultists who are both trying to tempt him to
Exactly.
their side of things. And
Yeah.
so I made it very kind of schematic in a sense. It's one of them embodies that kind of high magical sort of very ascetic sort of incense and church type of like ceremonial magic stuff. And
Yeah.
the other guy is all about the kind of more wild, orgiastic, Dionysian sort of side of things. Um, and I think that the idea, yes, is that you've got those two different atmospheres. Like you've got the kind of the sort of the robes and book bell and candle kind of incense type side, and then you've got the kind of the one that smells like cheap tobacco and cheap perfume and opium and hashish and um, absinthe. The sort of
Yes.
the decadent one, the road to excess leads the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom kind of one. um and I think you know that those two paradigms, like I suppose what you might call the ecstatic versus the ascetic, or gnosis that comes from like excitatory gnosis or inhibitory gnosis, um, like meditation versus dance, let's say,
Yes.
like still meditation versus wild dancing. those two poles. Um, that's something that we all who are interested in or practicing sort of magic, um, that we all have to navigate. Like, and obviously nobody is all one or the other, but there are certainly schools and traditions that are much more one than they are the other,
Yeah.
you know? Um, and I mean, you know, there are sort of, as I went back into it and worked on it again to publish it this time, I came across all this stuff that was from my reading at the time and from my previous reading. Like there's a lot of kind of in jokes if you are into like late Victorian and modernist literature. But one of the things is that one of the huge influences on the book is the short stories of William Butler Yeats, which hardly
Yeah.
anybody has ever read because he's known for his poetry, and rightly so, because he was a master poet. And he wasn't a great fiction writer, but his fiction is all very esoteric. You know, it's basically his characters are basically mouthpieces for his own occult investigations.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, there's a sort of a, and they also show up in his poems. Like they're speakers of some of the poems, and so you've got this kind of pair who show up in his books, in his fiction, and they show up uh, in some of his poems, called Michael Robartes and Owen Ahern, and they embody the sort of the ascetic kind of almost monkish um, dedication to a higher ideal, and the more kind of wild visionary poet. Um, and you know, people have theorized that they are somewhat based on Yeats himself and George Russell, who was known as A.E., um, who was a wild visionary sort of William Blake type. Um, and that was the sort of the pairing that I was imagining as well. Um, and so anybody who's actually read any of Yeats's sort of esoteric short stories like The Tables of the Law or The Visit of the Magi, um, those those are very present in what I wrote. And and for me, those were also one of my introductions to the occult, in fact, was through the poetic vision of Yeats, rather than someone who was, I don't know, like the Golden Dawn people, like Mathers or Rigardi or these people, um, who were perhaps um, more concerned with the philosophy and the technical and the historical. But Yeats always came at it from a sort of an artistic point of view,
Yeah, it's
you know,
interesting,
through
isn't it?
the. Mm,
I was just thinking that in a way, that's a similarity to, I suppose I've always been interested in mysticism
yeah,
and,
yeah,
meditation and stuff like that. But it's when you start seeing within, so for me, it would be musicians,
yeah,
that there was something going on with them, particularly people that you sort of revered. And there were plenty of them in the 60s that were obviously into whatever.
yeah,
But the deeper that you sort of dig into stuff, the more you realize how important that is as an element um, in creative thinking, obviously.
yeah.
Um,
Can we pause for a sec?
yeah.
Cool.
Right. So let's pick up where we were. We're talking about, oh, yeah, we were talking about artistic,
Mm,
that sort of undercurrent of,
yeah, and the fact that, you know, as you say, that kind of thread of mysticism in art in the 20th century, in music, you know, I think there is an awareness, and you're certainly very aware of it, like especially in the pop music of the 60s and 70s, that was very present. Um, but like if you look at the literature of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it is absolutely unavoidable. Like everybody was into it, from the most popular writers, um, up to the most kind of like highbrow. Look at people like, I mean, Yeats is a very obvious example, but then all those other kind of high modernist writers like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, people like that, absolutely steeped in mysticism and occultism. Um, if you look at, but then also sort of popular fiction, you know, there was a huge amount of popular fiction that was very much um, drawing on occult tropes and sort of, I mean, what were the things that were like huge bestsellers in the 1880s, for example? One of my speciality writers, Robert Louis Stevenson, um, Treasure Island, you might say, is not exactly a mystical or occult book, or is it? I mean, it is about hidden treasure.
It is about hidden treasure.
If you look at it as a archetypal hero's journey type thing, then you see that it is actually full of symbolic occultism. But then he wrote Jekyll and Hyde,
Yeah.
which obviously like ties together so many of the themes of science and the occult and the the underlying kind of paranoias of his age, things like degeneracy, like de-evolution, crime, drug addiction, alcohol, homosexuality, sexuality in general, like all of that unconscious stuff. Um, like if we accept, and I think we must, that the arrival of psychoanalysis with Freud and even more so with Jung, um, is an expression of the kind of the occultism, the mysticism, the symbolic structures of the human unconscious or the collective unconscious, and that stuff informs so much of the literature of the early 20th century. Um, even um, even someone like Gertrude Stein, who we think of as kind of very experimental, and very sort of very, very, very modernist. But at the same time, her approach to language um, is absolutely in that, like, I'm going to mix it up and mash it up and use words in ways that they were not meant for, um, adopt different identities, kind of deconstruct language. And that in itself is a kind of uh, a sort of a magical project. Um,
Absolutely. I
you
mean,
know, you look at where that goes, then
yeah,
it goes into the sort of all that stuff that we've talked about before, like but all stuff like cut ups and stuff
yeah,
like
exactly.
you know um collage, bricolage, like if you look at um even revolutions in things like perspective and in things like with the cubists, for example,
Yes.
um you know being able to see something in more than three dimensions at once
Yeah,
is absolutely a kind of a trance state or
yeah,
a drug induced state or a psychedelic state that is also attainable just through imagination. Or you look at someone like the paintings of someone like Kandinsky or Mondrian, and all of those, even though they look like, oh yes, this is art approaching abstraction, but they were highly informed by esoteric principles. you know Mondrian, he's the one who does those lovely like lines and dots and sort of blacks of color,
mm,
um, which was so influential on 20th century design. um, Most people don't realize that it was full of occult symbolism and like sacred geometry and numerology and um, And sometimes it's obvious, like uh, when you read um, when you read certain poets or novelists of the 20th century, like very obviously they have this kind of um, esoteric imagination or this kind of pagan imagination.
Mm.
I mean, thinking about, later on, people like Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, both in their different ways, addressing very magical, mythical, archetypal, um, pagan concerns,
Mm.
Um, I think that in some ways, the occult and the pagan and the magical and the mystical are inextricably linked to any poetry or any narrative art that is worth its salt.
Mm.
Because the the very idea of a narrative, the very idea of a poem, both of those are magical processes. Like
Well, yeah, I
imagine,
think
imagine a detective novel, right? We might think this is one of the most mundane things we can possibly imagine. A whodunit. But the whole point of a whodunit is that there is an occulted secret that
yeah,
is to be discovered.
yes,
You
and
know,
there are clues and there
and
are
there are clues,
procedures.
symbols, signs, and that you perform an operation of evoking what is hidden, of bringing out what is hidden, of uncovering the occult secret. Or you imagine, um, the any poem is is going to be using language in a way that is not just directly referential. It has symbolism. It has language that is figurative. It has complex symbols. And as soon as you make an extended metaphor, you could argue that that's kind of like you've just created like a little, you know, paradoxically, like a mini hypersigil. Um,
Yes,
or as soon as you start, and also because, say that's one aspect, I think, of poetry is that it must include language that is highly compressed or highly figurative to some degree, or evocative, right? You're evoking something, you're calling up some feeling or ambiance or reaction. But it also must include the sound quality, where it has rhythm and it
yes,
has um, sound, word music like alliteration or rhyme or whatever,
or
and
rhyming.
then yeah, and so then it becomes an incantation. It has an
Yes, of course it does.
incantatory
So
quality.
if you think of just very basic spells, they're right.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know? And we've mentioned this before, but the sort of bardic poetry was often musical anyway. Probably
yeah,
was all. If you go back far enough, poetry was probably always musical. There would be some musical accompaniment. I mean, all of that is about enchantment.
exactly, exactly, and literally so. And
Yes.
to enchantement, as we said before, like in singing, to in sing something. Um, and that we can also bring that back to certain creation myths, which the creator sings the world into being.
Sings the world into being. Yeah.
And therefore, the act of singing or the act of
Yep.
telling a tale, telling a story, or saying a poem out loud is to bring into being that world, those characters, that moment, or that knowledge, or that myth, um, is to breathe, like to inspire, to breathe into it, um, life.
Yes. So here's a question about the one of the characters in the book.
Yeah,
Um, so this young chap who you've got two other characters are sort of playing for his soul, basically,
yeah,
in a
yeah, yeah,
way. So we've got a possible one of them is possibly more divine than the other characters playing for this guy lad's soul.
Yeah.
You've also he is also um, training for the priesthood.
Yes.
So we've got a lot of stuff going on here, which and of course he's Irish.
Well, all three are Irish. All
Yeah, I
three of
know, but
those.
he
Yeah.
I'm thinking
He's
about him in
yes.
particular. You know, so
Yeah.
we've got characters. Let's put it this way: you are playing with the elements of Irish society, although it's placed in
Yeah.
Paris. Um, have you thought about what that says to you about your feelings of all those elements? You probably have thought this through because you're the sort of person who would have analysed this, I guess. But it speaks to me as something about how you connect and how you connect with religion in Ireland,
Yeah.
um, how it affects and did affect young people, obviously
Definitely.
young men, obviously.
Definitely. Now it's interesting because I think that certainly that is part of it, and a big part of it. And I don't know that I've ever really asked myself the question completely explicitly, what does having these kind of the three main characters being Irish, what does that say about my relationship to Irishness? Because clearly that's kind of fundamental to it.
Mm.
And I think that there is very much a kind of a playing out of my feelings about Irishness and about also about coming to terms with my own idea of my own Irishness and exile, about moving away from Ireland.
Yes.
What does that mean? And why were these Irish people in Paris at the time? Because there were revolutionaries, poets, writers, mystics, you know, all of these priests, all of these people were in Ireland or were in Paris at the time. And why? And why did they have to leave? And how did they feel about being Irish? And I think that for me, growing up in Ireland, you know, I was not born there, and neither of my parents were born in the Republic of Ireland, even though all of their families came from there. So I'm kind of like a child of immigrants who then came back. Um, but growing up in Ireland, um, I was often made to feel that I wasn't Irish enough because I didn't correspond to the idea in Cork in the 80s of what it meant to be kind of a normal Irish person because, um, uh, my accent would have been a bit closer to English, and because my mother's had an English accent and my father had a sort of a softened Northern Irish accent. So my accent was quite, and so people thought that I must be either English, so foreign, or just very posh. But of course, I was neither, really. Um, so I got bullied for being posh and bullied for being poor. Um, so it was really the worst of both worlds.
Yeah.
But but I think that as I got older, and I met more people who had a similar background to me, in the sense that they had parents who maybe um, hadn't lived in Ireland all their lives, or had been to other places, or they were born in other places, or they came, you know, um, and realized that actually there were other, Irish people who spoke like I did, um, and of course I learned to speak more like a Cork boy, um, out of self defense. But even when I'm back there now, because also living away, that I've lived away from for 20 years now, and my accent has become further modified by the fact that I have been an English teacher in France, in university and in school, and so I have tried to speak I've concentrated often on speaking more clearly and adhering slightly more to what they are supposed to be learning, because they are supposed to learn more
Yeah.
of like more British English than Irish English. And if I spoke to them with Irish slang, they wouldn't know what I was talking about. So
No, no.
my accent has been further kind of neutralized. And but when I go back these days, you know, talking to some old lady and she says, "All right, now, love, where are you from?" And I'd say, "I'm from Cork." And she'd go, "Ah, no, but you're not real Cork, like, are you? You know, tell me I'm not from there." And I'm like, "Well, I grew up here, you know." But anyway, the point is that that idea of having a young character who is basically, I think I worked it out. Is he? Yes, I think that the character of the young novice priest Thomas, um, he's he's just about 100 year born 100 years before I was, roughly, and thinking, if I had been born 100 years earlier, would I have been encouraged into the priesthood? Because
Yes. Would you have been
because
him? That's
yeah,
the
right. Because at the time, one of the only ways for an Irish person to get higher education was to go into holy orders,
yes. That's amazing because
especially.
that's very medieval.
Yes, it is. It is. Um, but even in Britain, I mean, people who wanted to be academics, like they would go and become a vicar, try and get a living, try and get, because it was a great way to fund the lifestyle
Yes.
of somebody who likes books and antiquarian
Yes. Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, all they had to do was show up and do a sermon on a Sunday, if that. Um, but in Ireland, it was a bit more charged because if you were a younger son, especially, um, you could not inherit a
No.
farm or a
No.
business or whatever. And, you know, and those who showed tendencies towards being highly literary or intellectual or so on, they would have been going to schools that were run, for example, for the boys, by the Jesuits or by the Christian Brothers, or by the Presentation Brothers or whatever. Um, and if you um, showed promise, one of the ways that you could get ahead was by becoming a priest or by becoming a nun. Now, obviously, even at the time, becoming a nun was like you wouldn't exactly be going on to do sort of doctorates.
No.
I mean, it happened, but rarely. But it was a way of opting out of the life of a wife and mother and being
Yeah.
able to dedicate yourself to the life of the mind, and especially as a teacher. Lots of nuns were teachers, and I think their real vocation was to teaching rather than necessarily religion. Um, Equally, lots of priests or brothers, lots of monks, um, their vocation really was to teaching, or in other cases it was to social work. It was to helping poor people, etc. But the only structure, the only game in town was the church. So if you wanted to be, let's say, a philosophy professor and you were Irish, the only way, the only way of being able to stay in education was by joining the priesthood. Um, Unless you came from the richer families, and particularly unless you came from the Protestant ascendancy, which, for example, if you were Protestant and you came from like a landed gentry family, you could go to Trinity College. But Trinity was for Protestants, you know?
Oh, right.
Yeah, yeah. And in Cork, there was Queen's College in Cork, Queen's College Belfast, Queen's College, I think there was another one. But they were for Catholics.
Right.
Yeah. And it's actually there's a real reflection on that kind of stuff because, for example, in um the in the book, Thomas's the first text that is from Thomas is his letter to his little sister Millie,
Mm.
and the letter starts off, and so she's supposed to be 15 at that time, and he's 23 or something. I think he's 23, And he writes to her, talking to her about the idea that she might stay in school and not leave school at 16, and that she might even consider going on to university. And I don't know if you remember, but there's a footnote about it. But at the time, Queen's College Cork, which is now University College Cork, um, it was one of the very first universities in Europe to admit women as undergraduates in the 1880s.
Mm.
So, and it had the first woman professor. I think her name was Mary Ryan. She was professor of Romance languages in 1910. They allowed women into medical school in the 1890s, which was not the case anywhere in Britain. Um, and so there's this idea that there was starting to be available the life of the mind for women, and that Ireland, strangely enough, for all that Ireland was backward in some ways, Ireland also had the first women members of parliament, certainly before Britain, but I think in all of Europe. They were elected in after the War of Independence in 1919, elected to Westminster and refused to take their seats. And there was a sort of, among the cultural nationalism movement in Ireland and among the political revolutionary nationalism movement, there was a lot of strong women and there was a lot of strong female figures. And the Irish War of Independence, a lot of women fought in it on the Irish side. And so, that, I think, wrestling with the idea that that there are these conflicting forces. There is Catholicism, there is the church, but there is not just the party line. There is also being able to, let's say, navigate the hierarchy of the church in order to subvert it by, well, it's because you want to be a teacher, or it's because you want to be a philosopher, or
Yeah.
it's because you want to be a writer, or it's because you want to be a social worker, or it's because, all of these things. But then, of course, there's also that really dark side where, yes, but it was such a dominant force in society that it also attracted people who were attracted by power and authority, and people who were attracted by secrecy, and it provided cover for horrendous abuse. And there's, especially in terms of the moral condemnation of any sexuality whatsoever. Certainly, homosexuality didn't even exist in Ireland, of course. But like women's sexuality, like women who, had the temerity to get pregnant out of wedlock, or women who, or just to act with any degree of freedom in that way. But yeah, I mean, all of those things are kind of on the table, and I think that it's not it's not for nothing that you know the frustrated academic who writes the introduction, the the young priest who goes and lives in the Irish college, which is also where I lived when I first moved to Paris, um, the the Northern Irish character who is the sort of the wicked uncle type um, person who's leading him astray in the flesh pots of Paris, and then the kind of more um, professorial doctor of occult philosophy, Dr. Crow, who is
Mm.
that kind of like, um, you know, uh, almost like an intellectual mentor, like an intellectual and spiritual mentor. And of course, at the time, I was in the university system and I was navigating those kind of relationships with people who were my professorial superiors, you know? So I think it's no wonder, yeah, it was probably playing out all these kind of psychodramas of me negotiating different ways of being Irish. But living in Paris, I think, was what finally really reconciled me to the idea that there is an Irishness that is available to me, that I can claim that I am, because even in Ireland, where people would sometimes call into question my Irishness, in Paris it was unmistakable because I was so much more Irish than anything else.
Yes.
And and then of course in Paris, I would think of Yeats and Joyce and Beckett and J.M. Singh and all these people, writers and heroes of mine who had lived in Paris also. Um, so I felt like I was continuing that tradition. And many of them felt they had to leave Ireland at the time they did, um, and go into exile
Yeah.
in order to flourish as artists and as people,
Mm.
get away from the kind of repressive society that it was. But luckily, I think now, when I left Ireland in 2003, it was, just in that kind of Celtic Tiger economic boom, but it was still a very kind of parochial and conservative country in many ways. And it was a bit like handing a teenager big wads of cash. It's all conspicuous consumption and
Yeah.
flashing it around and all of that. But I think in the last 20 years that Ireland has matured incredibly as
Mm.
a society. And when I go back there now, I find it a great pleasure. And I don't think it is half as constricted and repressive and sort of petty as it sometimes seemed to me when I was young. But again, that might be just being young, probably
No,
the fear of
I'm not
Ireland.
sure I'm not sure that it is. You mentioned something earlier, and I thought about what the Cornish were like,
Mm,
about what they classified as Cornish.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and it was, they'd say quite openly, or so and so, so and so's born and bred,
yeah.
right? So if you weren't born there
Mm,
and your parents didn't live there, they weren't born there, then you weren't Cornish,
right.
you see. That's obviously changed.
Mm.
Don't hear that being said.
No, but I mean,
I don't, well, I say, I haven't heard
it's
that said for a long time,
but
but
it's changed, but it's changed a lot in Ireland too, because like like Cornwall would have been also a place of emigration, like a place that people would leave. But of course now,
yes,
I hope for there, but it's certainly true for Ireland, is that there's been a massive influx of immigrants.
yeah,
And
exactly.
so when you see a kid who is called like um Ruri Okonoe, and he's got like Nigerian dad and an Irish mom, and he speaks with a strong Dublin accent, and he plays hurling and speaks Irish also. You kind of say to yourself, like, yes, he doesn't look like
No,
what we imagine, or but also even if he doesn't speak Irish, and even if he doesn't play hurling, and even if he doesn't have an accent that is strong like North Dublin, he can still be Irish.
yeah,
Of course, he can. You know,
exactly.
and I think people have really started to realize that now, that not only is Irishness not really about where you're born or about the color of your skin or your accent or your where you brought up, but it's a lot of it is about what you do. Like being part of a culture is what culture do you practice? You
Yes,
know,
that's a good point. Because
what society do you participate in?
yeah,
Um, like if I, we say this about Celtic languages. There's no such thing as a Celtic ethnicity, like in terms of genetics.
yeah,
But Celticity, like being a Celt, means speaking a Celtic language and doing Celtic cultural things. And if you do those, like if you participate in Celtic traditions, cultures, languages, music, um, all of that stuff, then you are one. And it's the same with I think any sort of nation now. Um, you don't have to prove it by some kind of uh, 23andMe genetic testing. And also people who do, like, and often, let's face it, it's like often Americans or people who are part of other like colonized um, colonies. Um, they'll do these genetic testings and say, oh, well, I'm 37% Scandinavian and I'm 12% German and I'm 7% Moroccan and I'm 15% Irish. And then, but they're not. I mean, they're not like their genes come from vaguely those geographical locations, but
Yes.
it doesn't give them any claim on those
No.
identities. But you know, it does if they decided to go and go to their local Irish centre and
Yeah.
learn Irish dancing and learn about Ireland and learn a few words of Irish, like, and say yes because I want to, honor the Irish part of my heritage or whatever it is, or the German part, or the Norwegian part, or the Moroccan part, or the Lebanese part, or whatever it is. Um, I think culture is something that you practice. It's not. It is
I,
something
I,
it's something
I
you
agree with
inherit.
you.
It's something you inherit, but you don't inherit it in your blood. You inherit it through practice, through
Yeah. I
doing
mean,
stuff.
you can feel something as an affinity to a place. That
Hmm.
is, but then if you don't engage with it,
Yeah.
um, I, I'll give you an example from my life. Um, yeah, I did the sort of ancestry thing because I was quite interested because my dad was such a conundrum. And it transpires that my family from my father's side, on both of the parents of my father, so grandparents, lived in Sussex.
Hmm.
I'm in Sussex at the moment. Well, not at the moment. I'm in Kent, but
Hmm.
because I'm in the office. But I'm not that keen on Sussex. It doesn't make me feel. I don't feel at home in Sussex. I feel more at home in Kent with the
Yeah.
people that, and I don't know what that is because it's not really that logical. I can sort of say, well, it's because of this and that.
Hmm.
But when I go down to Cornwall, and I've just come back from Cornwall, um, I do feel at home there,
Yeah.
and I grew up there. I wasn't born there; I was born in Kent, but I grew up in Cornwall. So, the first thing I do is, if I can, I get down to the beach and I walk on the beach,
Yeah.
and I and it, and I do get that feeling that I belong there.
Hmm.
Now, so I don't. So obviously, from the genetic point of view, I certainly don't feel an affinity. It was interesting walking the ground that my ancestors had walked because
Yeah.
I walked the villages that they lived in.
Hmm.
Um, but there's something unhappy about it for me with that. I don't know what it
Yeah.
is because I don't know what that is. But to me, it just doesn't quite vibe with me.
Yeah. There's
But,
definitely, I think that there's
you know,
definitely something about, there's a kind of a bereavement of displacement, and there's a mourning of the places that your ancestors left, you know?
that is a very good point and quite possibly true.
Yeah. I think
Um,
I've
just tell
had
you what,
that. Yeah. Yeah. Go
yeah.
on.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying there's lots of things, forces at play that
Mm.
we can't
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know,
But if you look, when you visit a place where your ancestors have been miserable and had to leave, you feel that sort of like sense of loss and a sense of
yes,
like there's nothing like, especially, I mean, it's a bit different now, but 100 years ago, 150 years ago, um, leaving home, emigrating at that time with every expectation that you may never see your people again,
exactly. That was
never
like a
see your home
death.
again. It's like a death. It's like a
It is
death.
a
It's
death.
like a bereavement on
Yeah,
both sides for the people who
yes,
stay and the people who leave. And
yes,
I think that I was just in totally different circumstances talking about the um, Indian American writer. I think it's Champa Lahiri, but because but one of her like there's a title of one of her books, which I think is Champa Lahiri, but the inheritance of loss, which I think is just it's about migration and emigration and how there's a sort of a generational trauma that is passed down of the
mhm,
loss of the homeland.
yes,
Um, and then especially when it's a kind of a, new immigrant population who are struggling in the country they end up in, they often kind of cut the ties to the
yeah,
original culture because they don't want their kids to be held back by the stigmatized culture. And then they lose it all over again because
yeah,
the kids don't speak the language and they don't know the place. And then when they do go home, to the place their ancestors came from, they feel like a total stranger. And that is awful,
Yeah.
you know? And it's funny to hear because my theory is that this is true that just as much as somebody from Bangladesh can have that feeling, whose family is like 2 generations or 3 generations in Britain, and they go back to Bangladesh and they're like, oh my God, I'm a total stranger here. It's so funny to hear that it can even happen between Kent and Cornwall, and I am willing to believe
Yes.
it can. It
Yes. Well, Kent and
absolutely can.
Sussex even.
Or Sussex, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, Kent and
Um,
Sussex.
yeah,
And
because
Sussex and Cornwall. So yeah,
well,
it's
I mean,
fascinating.
just
I think it's fascinating.
where I'm living now, you know, we we moved because we at first we were living in the place where Laura's grandparents had had a big house for many years, and their family were from that region, and but we had to leave there after her grandmother died, and we moved like literally 15 kilometers away, but we crossed the Dordogne River, and now we're in a
Right.
different department, different region,
Yeah.
and we are no longer in the Gironde, which is where sort of Bordeaux and its hinterland. We have crossed over the Dordogne north to the Dordogne region, which is known locally and more anciently as Périgord. And I swear the people are totally different.
Yes.
And
I, I,
they
I
are
could.
they are so different. They're so different. And I said to them, like, I'm like, this is weird. Like, people here are so much more down to earth and welcoming and kind and curious. And you know what they said to me? They said, "Oh yeah, but that's because you were living in Gironde. All those bastards care about is wine and money, and they're famously like mean and unfriendly." And we were like, "Well, nobody told us that." We're like, "Yeah, well, they wouldn't announce it, would they?" It's like,
Well,
and
it's
here,
interesting because I would have said the
totally
same
different.
thing between Sussex and Kent.
Yeah, yeah,
Because although this seems utterly ridiculous, because people are moving backwards and forwards and all the rest of it, but in Sussex, there's a there's a I would say a sort of the earth thing going on in Kent.
yes,
That's I mean, I've always sort of felt that
yeah,
where you sort of know where you are pretty much with people.
mm.
And then sometimes you go to somewhere, like I would have said, I'm not saying that all the people in Sussex are terrible because I've got some really great
Of course
friends
not,
there.
of course not.
But there's a lot of people with a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah,
And I do think that sort of changes the dynamic of how people relate to the world when there's no risk.
yeah. But I want to say, you know what? I want to say that it's also got to do with what in France they call terroir, which is like terrain, territory. It's to do with what are what is the geography of the place? What are the
Yes,
natural resources of the place? Like, for
yes,
example, over in Gironde, on the other side of the river, it's all these very kind of broad, rolling fields and low hills, and it's the floodplain of the Dordogne River, and it's vines, vineyards, 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 as far as the eye can see. And it has been for, I would say, 2,000, if not 3,000 years, those vines have been there. So it is a landscape that has been tamed, but like old. The relationship of human labor to that land and the relationship of I mean, wine has been big money for the last few thousand years, big business. And then, down the river to Bordeaux, where it was exported from.
yeah,
And Bordeaux also not only exported wine, but was one of the stations in the triangular trade, slave trade. They also plantation owners.
right,
So but here, as soon as you cross the river, the geography is different.
yeah,
It's hills and forest, and it's isolated villages and mountains, and it's a bit more wild and woolly and weird, and it just feels like here we are living in the we're living in on the edge of the wilderness. Like, we're living right by our doorstep. There is hills and forest and the wild, you know, and it just feels different. Like, it's not the same soil, you know. Um, it's amazing. But now, speaking of which, I'm going to have to leave you
yes.
momentarily because
Well, we're gonna have to wrap
yeah,
up here. I think.
the village that we've lived in, that we've come to live in, we've been here now just over a year, has been so welcoming and so pleasant and so much like activity and stuff, that I've been roped into, the local cultural committee to help organize the Franco-British table quiz.
Well,
Um,
that sounds interesting.
so it's all about, entente cordiale and stuff.
Right. Well, you better do that because yes, absolutely. It's time is rolling on. That was great. Well,
Thank you so much. And
I wish you all the
yeah,
best with this book because it really is excellent. And
thank you. Thank you. Well,
we didn't
you,
even get onto your roaming around Paris doing answering questions tarot style. We'd have to
oh,
do
yeah,
that at some point
we will.
because I think
That's
actually that could link into the book quite well.
Oh yeah,
But,
completely. Like and also what we were just talking about in terms of the character of a region and the people is kind of psychogeography. But then
yes,
psychogeography, of course, in an urban setting, leads us to that derive, that metromancy, like reading the city
yeah,
like a mystical engine, for sure.
exactly.
All right.
All
Well,
right,
next time then.
that's
Next
that's
time.
for another time, right?
Excellent. Thanks a million, Vic.
All right then.
Bye.
Take care, mate. See you.
Bye.